Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
We're the show that takes your sources, cuts through the information overload, and gets right to the heart of complex topics. This deep dive is tailored just for you, based on the sources you shared with us.
That's right. We're here to help you unpack some specific material today,
Yeah,
give you the key takeaways you need to be well-informed, quickly and thoroughly.
absolutely. So today we're diving into an analysis focused on the Oxford University pro-Palestine protests.
hmm
And our main source for this, the material we're unpacking, is an excerpt. It's from a piece presented on the Westferry Times channel titled Oxford University Faces Ongoing Pro-Palestinian Protests.
Yeah, and it's important to note, as outlined in that piece, the analysis itself was hosted by Emily and featured insights from Dr. James Carter. He's described as a political analyst and lecturer in Middle Eastern studies.
Right, so we're walking through their analysis today.
Exactly. Our
Yeah.
job is to relay what they presented.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Our mission here is to explore the background, the key events, what the protesters were demanding, how the university responded, and sort of the wider implications of these protests at Oxford.
All based purely on what's discussed in this specific source material from Westferry Times.
Precisely. So where does their analysis begin? The background.
It does. It starts by placing these Oxford protests within, well, a much broader context, a global wave of pro-Palestinian activism.
Okay.
And the analysis points out that this activism really intensified after the Israeli military campaign in Gaza that started back in October 2023.
And that includes universities globally, right? Students, staff, getting organized.
Yes, organizing demonstrations,
Mhm.
showing solidarity, and often pushing their institutions to, rethink ties with Israeli entities. That's the backdrop the analysis provides.
So how did this manifest at Oxford specifically, according to the source?
Well, the Westferry Times analysis highlights that the movement really picked up steam at Oxford in May 2024.
May 2024.
Yeah, that's when students began setting up encampments, these sort of temporary protest camps. Initially, it was outside the Museum of Natural History, and then later they moved to a very prominent spot, the Radcliffe Camera area.
And the source mentions who was behind this.
It does. It identifies the coordinating group as Oxford Action for Palestine, or OA4P, described as a student-led group.
OA4P, and their main points. What were they pushing for, according to this analysis?
The source states their advocacy focused on sort of two core things. One was transparency in university investments, where the money is,
Right.
and the other was divestment. So actually selling off investments in companies that are linked to Israeli military operations.
Transparency and divestment. Got it.
Exactly. So that kind of sets the scene. Now, the analysis then moves into the key events and the university's response.
Okay, yeah. This is where things seem to escalate a bit based on the source material. What events does it highlight?
It flags a couple of significant incidents. One was in May 2024. 17 students were arrested. This was after they occupied the vice chancellor's office at Wellington Square.
Occupying the VC's office, that's quite direct action.
It is. And then the analysis points to another major disruption in June. Protesters occupying the examination school's building.
Right, during end-of-year exam.
Exactly. And the source highlights a very specific consequence of that action. Exams were actually canceled for 153 second-year chemistry students.
Wow, 153 students. That's a major impact on their studies.
Definitely. A significant disruption.
So how did the university handle these actions? What does the analysis say about their response?
Well, the analysis states the university, expressed support for peaceful protests, which is fairly typical.
Sure.
But it also strongly condemned the disruptive actions like the occupation of the VC's office and obviously the exam disruption.
And what about the encampments themselves? Any specific response mentioned?
Yes, regarding the camps, the source notes the administration actually threatened legal action.
Legal action. Okay.
And according to the analysis, this threat directly led to the protesters disbanding the Radcliffe Camera Camp. That happened in July 2024.
So it sounds like a mix, condemning disruption, threatening legal action against the camps.
That's how the source presents the university's reaction, yes.
Okay, so we have the protests, the disruptions, the university's reaction. Let's circle back to the protesters' demands. What specifically were they asking Oxford to do, according to the Westferry Times analysis?
The source lays out several key demands. As we touched on, transparency about investments
Right?
and divestment from companies linked to Israeli military operations. Those are central.
Uh-huh.
But also, they demanded an end to university partnerships with Israeli academics institutions.
Ending academic ties, too.
Yes. And finally, they asked for university support to help rebuild Gaza's educational infrastructure.
So a fairly broad set of demands: financial, academic, and humanitarian support.
It seems to cover the main points listed in the analysis.
Did the university take any steps that the source connects to these concerns? Anything concrete mentioned?
The analysis does mention a couple of institutional actions taken around that time. One was launching a new graduate scholarship. This was specifically for students who had been displaced by the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank.
A scholarship fund, okay.
And also, they reportedly increased support for academics considered at risk. They did this through partnerships with organizations like GERARE, the Council for At-Risk Academics.
So some actions focused on individuals affected by the conflict.
Yes, the source presents these as steps the university took in that period.
Now, it wasn't just students and the administration involved, was it? What about faculty, staff, the wider university community? How does the analysis describe their reactions?
It definitely reports mixed reactions. There wasn't a single view.
Understandable.
On one hand, the analysis notes significant support for the protesters. It mentions over 170 faculty and staff members signing an open letter.
What did the letter say?
It apparently supported the encampments, and it echoed those calls we just discussed for divestment and for aid for Gaza's educational institutions.
So clear support from a segment of faculty and staff, but you said mixed.
Yes, because the analysis also notes that other members of the university community raised concerns.
Concerns about what specifically?
Mainly about the disruptions, the impact on academic activities, on ceremonies. Things like the exam cancellations we mentioned earlier clearly cause worry for some.
Right, the disruption versus the cause. A common tension in these situations.
Precisely. That tension is evident in the reactions described in the source.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Thinking beyond Oxford, what does this analysis suggest about the broader implications? What can we learn from this specific case?
Well, the source suggests these protests really highlight a growing demand, maybe pressure is a better word, on universities. Pressure to make sure their investments and their partnerships align with ethical considerations, with human rights.
So it's pushing universities to think more about their role beyond just education and research.
Exactly. The analysis frames academic institutions as, important spaces for political expression, for activism. And the situation at Oxford is presented almost as a case study. It reflects, according to the source, a global trend where universities are increasingly being held accountable by students, by staff, for their connections, real or perceived, to international conflicts and human rights issues.
A trend towards greater accountability. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And looking ahead, the analysis doesn't suggest this is all over now that the camps are gone, does it? What does it anticipate might happen next at Oxford?
No, it definitely doesn't portray it as finished. The analysis suggests that even though the physical encampments ended, the energy, the momentum behind the movement is still there.
So it continues, but maybe in different ways.
That seems to be the prediction. The analysis anticipates activism will likely continue, just maybe shifting forms, perhaps more organized assemblies or targeted campaigns focusing on specific demands, or working through internal university committees.
Less visible, perhaps, but still pushing.
Yeah, ongoing pressure for that transparency, for reconsidering affiliations, seems likely, according to the source. It concludes by saying the situation is still dynamic. How the university responds next will probably shape what the movement does.
It feels like the core tension, then, based on this Westferry Times analysis we've been discussing, is this push for, let's call it, institutional ethical responsibility, coming up against the university's need to, keep things running smoothly, maintain academic operations, manage existing relationships and partnerships.
That captures the central conflict highlighted in the analysis quite well, I think.
And understanding this specific example at Oxford, why is that relevant for you, our listener, even if you have no direct connection?
Well, the analysis suggests its relevance lies in how it mirrors these bigger debates happening everywhere. Debates about the role of powerful institutions, about ethics in a globalized world, about the forms activism takes today. These aren't just happening at Oxford. You see echoes on campuses and in communities worldwide.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the power dynamics involved. What does this analysis from the Westferry Times suggest about that balance or maybe imbalance of power between students, faculty, and university leaders when these big, complex, global issues land right on their doorstep?
It certainly shines a light on how challenging it is for universities to navigate these situations. Balancing academic freedom, freedom of speech, operational needs, and these deeply felt ethical demands from within their own communities.
Indeed. A complex picture. And thanks for helping us unpack the analysis presented in the source.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive exploring the Westferry Times analysis of the Oxford pro-Palestine protests.
Yes, thank you. Stay informed and keep thinking critically.
Until next time.